How to criticize your church. I'll be the first to admit that I don't always agree with everything taught in the church. I don't always agree with the way the scriptures are interpreted or applied. I can't always amen the conclusion of the sermon. And sometimes I'm baffled at the parts of the Bible we emphasize versus the parts that we neglect. And I've walked out of more than one assembly asking, shouldn't the church be more than this? You may be able to relate with some of those sentiments, and if you can, you're probably familiar with the way that these frustrations tend to build up inside of you. They manifest themselves in different ways, but the most common way is by quickening our tongues to criticism. Admittedly, I've been very critical of some of the failings that I've seen in the church. It's important to state that being critical isn't wrong. Every congregation needs to be open to criticism. Churches that are open to the evaluation of a critical eye will guard themselves against complacency. We admire the many reformers of church history because they did the hard job of being critical of the institution. And God help the church that dismisses critics without evaluating their concerns. But criticism comes in different forms, and it's important that we critique correctly. We don't want to be destructive, we want to be constructive. The destructive critic really doesn't need very much introduction. They are the lazy complainer who finds amusement in denigrating the efforts of others. The satisfaction that they find in critiquing springs up from the same poisoned well where the gossip drinks. On the other hand, the constructive critic finds no joy in belittling the work of others. Their criticisms come from a place of genuine concern for the church and a desire to see wrongs made right. Being a constructive critic is hardly ever glamorous. In fact, it's not uncommon for men to hate constructive critics. The Bible is filled with men of God who played the role of the constructive critic to those who claim to be the people of God. The Old Testament prophets, the apostles, and Jesus were all hated for criticizing the way their countrymen practiced religion. So why did they choose to be constructive critics? They criticized because they loved. They couldn't stand to see people drifting away from God. They were compelled to speak hard truths even in the face of disdain from their own people because they felt the truth was worth sacrificing for. So how do we go about criticizing constructively? I've got 7 things that will at least get us started when considering how to be a constructive critic. Number 1 is ask your heart if you love the people in the church that you're criticizing or if you just love criticizing. Ask God to remove any pride or self-righteousness from your heart. When you're critical of something, offer a solution for improvement or have the humility at least to admit that you don't have one. Make sure your criticisms are rooted in eternal truths, not just church or cultural trends. Criticism without work ethic is complaint. If you want to see improvements in your church culture, you have to set an example through your willingness to work towards them. And then ask God for courage. Constructive critics are men and women of courage. It's easy to go along with the flow and with the status quo. It takes courage to step out and to point out things that may be out of place. And then finally, prepare yourself for the judgment of men. People, even people that you love, will call you a sellout, a liberal, a false teacher. They'll tell you that you're too negative, that you only focus on the bad parts, that you're deceived, that you're arrogant for assuming that you know better than all of the men who came before you. But if they did that to Jesus, Jesus tells us that we should expect the same in return. If the past 2,000 years have taught us anything, it's that the church is not immune to error. Historically, God has used critics to correct his people, and the church needs to be humble enough to evaluate critiques. At the same time, those who feel the need to fill the role of the critic need to be humble enough to critique correctly.